This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. It's another in my series of filmmakers on film. Sean Hartofilis is the man before you, and we will be speaking about his latest film, Covadonga, as well as some other films that he's made and the film industry in general. American filmmaker Sean Hartofilis is my guest. It's the third in my series on filmmakers on film. About a month, 4 or 5 weeks ago, he sent me an email out of the blue about his latest film called Covadonga, and I watched it online, and it was a good film, and I decided to ask him if he wanted to be interviewed, so here he is. So let me just ask you, Sean, before I get into my usual bit about your background, it's interesting, Covadonga, the whole central metaphor and the title goes back to the start of the Spanish Reconquista. Could you just explain a little bit what Covadonga was and how it relates to the film in general?
Yeah, as you say, it was a seminal battle, or the kind of first Christian victory in the Reconquista, which was reclaiming Spain for the Catholics and kind of repelling the Moorish invasion around 700 AD, and that wasn't complete until around 1400. So it's kind of so that's obviously a literal historical event, and it echoes the personal kind of battles of our main character in the film Covadonga. And what I'm trying to kind of explore is Covadonga, as you say, is a historical battle where the Christians or the Catholic resistance defeated the Moors in the Asturian Mountains at the northern tip of Spain, and started repelling them south and reclaiming Spain for the Catholics around the year 700, and it was another 700 years until they finally reclaimed the country. But yeah, so the film Covadonga is about a character's dark past via his wife's violent death, and how that is kind of influencing his present in terms of his processing of the world. And I see echoes in our historical conflicts that we're still fighting today. So it's about cycles of violence, and it kind of explores, well, how do we escape these cycles?
Let me just, before we get into you, go pick up on the fact that how you're distributing the film, because I saw it on Vimeo, which is probably after YouTube the most popular video sharing channel or website. And is that how you're distributing it to most critics? Or I think in your email to me you had said you've rented out some select theaters here or there.
Yeah, I'm distributing it through the website covadonga.film through the platform Vimeo On Demand. So critics, I'm sharing a password protected link so they can watch it for free. But it's roughly the same process for an audience member to watch it. However, you probably watched it on your computer, whereas hopefully most people would get Vimeo Demand on their smart TVs like Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, or any sort of streaming device or smart TV setup. So yeah, by distributing it independently through that platform, forgive me, my alarm here, I'm able to charge what I want for rental and purchase, to offer it to everybody in the world at the same time for the same price. And they can watch it however they'd like, which is, phone, computer, tablet, smart TV, any streaming device. So for me, it's a great opportunity to learn more and not kind of disconnect myself from the audience at this last stage of the filmmaking process. My previous film, Beach Pillows, I had a distributor, Gravitas Ventures, and you get all on the platforms worldwide, but you're kind of detached in terms of understanding the results of your efforts to market it, because you get quarterly reports. So, once every 3 months, I would get some information about where we were selling, whereas this way, I'm able to, push the movie in different ways and then see, in real time who's purchasing the film, or not who, but when it's being purchased. And that's valuable for someone in my position. One, I keep more of the profit. Two, I can charge less for it. And three, I just learn more about what's effective. So people are trying to, nobody knows anything, as William Goldman, who passed away recently, said. And especially with these new platforms and new ways to consume media, everybody's trying to figure out how to best share it with consumers and how to, exploit it, make money out of it. So I consider this a good opportunity, and I'm learning a lot and enjoying the experience for sure.
Well, I'll get back to more about distribution and the independent film, I guess, the independent film movement in the U.S. and how it's morphed over the last 15, 20 years and the first part of this century. But let me just ask about you yourself. Just saying your name, Hartofilis, you said you were Greek, and I think you said it's an Irish Gothic tale. What role did your ancestry, if any, play in this? Because we mentioned Covadonga is from a historical title. So are you well aware of history? Are you a history buff?
Yeah, I try to be. I mean, certainly history influenced aspects of this story and inspired parts of the story and the title. I am, my mother's from Ireland, so she's one of 10 from County Derry, Northern Ireland, and she left when she was 18 to kind of escape the struggle. She's a Catholic, and there was limited opportunity and increasing violence in the county she lived. But she's the only one who came over, so most of my family, hundreds of cousins, aunts and uncles, they're in Ireland. So this movie, to me, there's Irish folk music in it, and the Irish folk singers, Luke Kelly and Shane MacGowan of the Dubliners and the Pogues, respectively, they kind of inspired me to sing these songs in the film, and just kind of the echoes in the Irish struggle and kind of, the British colonialist invasion and occupation of that country, that island, and how that echoed in the story of Covadonga and also the story of Martin Raven, the main character whose property is being trespassed upon.
So what was the first film that you can ever recall seeing, and what was the first film that made you say, oh, I can do that, or I want to do that?
That's a great question. There's a few. My dad was studied acting growing up in New York City. He's a waiter, but always wanted to be an actor. And he had an affinity for old classic films, Turner Classic Movies. So I kind of came up on that stuff. But just some tentpoles that I remember in my childhood. I just remember Rocky being a big deal when I was a kid, and my dad was a boxer. So, that felt close to us in ways. And also it was just, so entertaining and just such like a classic hero archetype. So, but I didn't understand that what I was watching was pretend, was fiction. My dad said, "Oh no, Rocky's just an actor. He's, he's acting." And I'm like, okay, so this boxer also acts, and I didn't know what acting was. I thought he like stood on stage with a microphone or something. So anyway, that some of those movies, and then, as I just remember in college, having seen the film The Graduate growing up and loving it, being like, there's something about this movie that's very entertaining and captivating. But in college, when I started to consider making films myself and actually did start making films myself, I just remember sitting and watching The Graduate in a dark room and just getting a sense of the director and the camera. That's kind of that has a French New Wave style, and it's just so kind of intrepid in terms of the cinematography in combination with the music, and then a character who was experiencing something that emotionally that I was feeling at that time. Just the collision of those elements made me feel like, this is powerful, deep stuff. But I'd always loved movies and kind of had an eye on wanting to make them for sure. I loved Laurel and Hardy growing up, Charlie Chaplin, Frank Capra movies.
Well, you grew up in the New York area. Did you ever watch the old Joe Franklin show? Because when I was a kid, Joe Franklin on Channel 9 would have the old black and white silent films on his late night talk show. Do you remember that, or you're too young?
I was probably too young. I don't recall. That may have been what was on the TV via my father, but I'm not sure. I grew up on Long Island, but that sounds like a cool program.
So are you drawn more to being behind the camera or acting in front of the camera, or both? Because you do act, you're the main character in this film, Covadonga, but would, if you had your druthers and could make films as you chose, would you rather just all be behind the scenes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on the story and the characters that needed playing. Prior to my first feature, Beach Pillows, I had acted in kind of everything I made. I wrote, directed, and edited everything I made. That was kind of instilled in college, just doing everything yourself. And then my first feature, I was like, well, we're going to raise some money here. It'd be nice to have a better chance of making it back. But in order to raise that money, actors and faces that people recognize are really helpful. So I was able to get Jeffrey Wren, Vincent Kartheiser, Annette O'Toole, and Richard Schiff. And I felt like that, I wrote it, I directed it, I ultimately edited it, so I could step back, and that might be too much for my first feature to act in it. So I thought they did a great job. But with this, I was kind of like, I think I was longing to be back out there, especially since it was such a personal movie to me and incorporated all of these original songs that I'd written. I kind of painted myself into a corner narratively where it was going to be difficult to get somebody to do all the things I wanted the lead character in Covadonga to do. So, that was maybe subconscious, but ultimately intentional. So to answer your question, I look up to guys like Charlie Chaplin and John Cassavetes, who can kind of artists that don't consider themselves limited by disciplines. Really, my life and film are just vehicles to express myself. And I think, I believe it's important. It feels purposeful for me to do so. So, the acting in this one was intentional, and it was rewarding. And in the future, I think it'll hopefully be a little of both.
Well, I want to ask a question regarding the process of making a film, especially one with a low budget. And by the way, I mean, are we talking a micro budget here, like 5 or 10,000, or did you have like 6 figures to work with?
Somewhere in the middle, but I think definitely micro. 40 grand, $40,000 is what I made Covadonga for all in, which was a tenth of what I made my first feature, Beach Pillows. That was $400K. So yeah, I felt like I learned a lot of lessons. I felt like I made the first one very efficiently, and we kind of earned a higher production value, and it looks like $1 million movie or a studio movie even. But yeah, I found out you can go even smaller. So that was I intentionally went much smaller in terms of focusing the setting and the cast on Covadonga, but also limiting my resources so that I could take that French New Wave approach and just try to forge ground by being as creative as possible.
To pick up on that sort of self-limitation, Alfred Hitchcock once stated that writing the script and working things out on his storyboards was the hard part, and then just filming what he had done was the easy part. With independent filmmaking, though, do you look for sort of happy accidents on the set that would happen, little opportunities, like if it's raining, or there's a television show from years ago called Nowhere Man, and the pilot episode, this guy is being pursued by this group called the Organization, and there are clouds that roll in the final shot down this long highway that you couldn't have planned. Do you look for little opportunities, poetic little things that happen, or are you more the Hitchcock, want to control it all?
I think probably a combination, but I think if you're doing it right, I think Hitchcock is right in that you put in all this preparation, because when you're on set, time and money are just flying out the window. So in order to not lose your mind and take advantage of everybody around you and all your resources, you need to have so much planning. But then I think when you're on set, exactly as you say, it's incumbent upon you to find the magic, and that comes with accidents, as most kind of filmmakers and artists echo. It's you prescribe this story that you're going in to make and get all these tools and map it out, as you say, with storyboards. But what you're really trying to do is create an environment where something you didn't expect can happen. And whether that's taking advantage of a bit of weather, like the very first shot of Covadonga, we got up early enough. We actually shot that 2 days.
The Stygian mists rising off the lake.
Yes. Right. So we got up the first day and we shot it and got the move pretty well. This big tracking shot across the lake. But my DP actually, I'll give him credit. He's like, if we got up earlier, this could look a little better. We could get some of that fog, and we did, and that's the kind of thing. Yeah, I think it adds a ton to just set the tone and just adds production value. So stuff like that, where you're working in concert with the environment to just raise everything's level. Exactly right. So a little of both, if that's an adequate answer.
The film has well, you don't realize it until it happens, that the film has a flashback, and there are things that happen that in the first half of the film that you don't, and I don't want to give too much away, that you don't suspect is going to happen in the second half. Um, was that something planned out? Was the script laid out and you followed the script, or did you somehow devise some of that in editing?
Yeah, I wrote the script that way. It was funny. It just, I wrote the camera pushes across the leg. I wrote exactly what you see on the screen, and then we jump back to the inciting incident because those first 20 minutes of the film are silent. So I
Yeah.
felt like, if we were to show that inciting incident and him accosting this boy, the kind of event that spurs the story, then those scenes with him chopping wood or shaving or dancing with a mop wouldn't have the same effect on an audience. They've got to be mysterious in order, because we want to just figure out what we're watching, and kind of, it was important to me to reveal the story to the audience slowly and make them active participants as opposed to giving them all the required information up front.
But it also allows the viewer some depth, because when you go back, once that little flashback happens and you get to the what you called inciting incident, you go back and say, "Oh, now it's a little bit more sinister what he was doing." Because to go back to Hitchcock, if you have a tea party, it's just a tea party. But if you know there's a body under the floor where they're having the tea party, it changes the tea party totally.
Yeah, it's the difference between suspense and surprise.
Yeah.
So that, yes, I was. He's the master, and you try to take all those lessons, for sure.
Well, speaking of masters, since we're going to talk about indie film, uh, recently on I think it was Netflix released the supposed last film of Orson Welles, which was recut and tweaked a bit by Peter Bogdanovich, and he's sort of the guy who is, in a sense, the father of American independent cinema. Is there anything within, say, a Wellesian approach? Because Wells was constantly innovating, whether it's from camera angles to the way stories were told. He'd do this kind of film, that kind of film. He'd use big stars like Charlton Heston. He'd use, nobodies that people didn't know here in the U.S. Um, is that the kind of career you'd want, or do you want to use a film like this to get into Hollywood, or are you afraid that you may be corrupted by Hollywood and end up doing, what is the one with Vin Diesel, the series
Fast
that,
and Furious?
yeah, Fast and Furious 38,
Yeah. You always want. I think anybody would be lying if they didn't say they wanted more opportunity, more resources to tell their stories. But for me, I'm not looking. One, I think this Hollywood or the studio system, as it's known, has changed so much in even the last 5 or 10 years. Certainly the last 30, and is continuing to change to the point where they're producing something that maybe is more corporate, and then independent artists now have more opportunities to get their work out there, and even on television you see kind of more personal stories, or adult stories. So anyway, to answer your question, I know what stories I want to tell, and they're all ones I've written or will write. So I'm not looking to direct Fast Nine or anything. But at the same time, that's not my goal. That's not my ambition. But my ambition is to make a living off of my work, And I think that remains the kind of conundrum or the obstacle for every artist, because, art and commerce, they've historically had kind of a contentious relationship. You'd like to get them in harmony so that you're able to just, as opposed to jumping from rock to rock, like looking for where you can put your feet, just get in a field and run. So I want my work to be seen by as many people as possible, and that'll create opportunities for me to get the next stuff going. But so yeah, I mean, I'm an independent. I admire the independence. I look up to Orson Welles. I look up to people like John Cassavetes, Peter Bogdanovich, people that change the form through their own ideas. They don't try to fit into a system and kind of do the next Star Wars. You know what I mean? They try to kind of change the language of cinema so that they can expand the vocabulary for other people to tell stories. So my work is very personal, comes from kind of a specific personal place. And I think personal stories are the ones that shape the world. People relate to things that are deep within somebody as opposed to glommed off of the culture that already exists. I want to add to the conversation. I don't want to just talk.
By mentioning John Cassavetes, I think since his death 30-some years ago, probably the only indie filmmaker that has worked regularly and done what they want with some measure of independence is another John Sayles. When I look at their two careers, the thing that sticks out to me is they made adult films. By adult, I don't mean pornography. I mean that you're dealing with things that people 30, 40, 50, 60 can relate to. Hollywood seems to always be centered on the youth market. Why do you think there is the obsession within Hollywood towards gearing for the youth, whereas independent filmmakers have, I guess, gone more for adult intelligence? I mean, your film, whether one likes it or not, even by the choice of the title and the metaphor of the title, suggests that you think more highly of the viewer than a Fast and Furious 27.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple answers to that question, but I think it's commerce. So kids movies, when you lower the bar, you expand the target. So movies for kids, that means everybody can see them. Whereas a rated R movie, you've got 20 years of people who can't see them. So they say, not only am I missing those people, now I'm not planting any seeds where I can sell them the next one. So they want to kind of condition these kids to value certain properties and then kind of sell them the same thing throughout their life, and continue to create new audience members. So I think they see older people as a lost cause, because they're going to die sooner. It's like marketing smoking to kids. So anyway, it's business is why that's done. But I think you'll always find the harmonious bounce back. People long for stories that are bigger, more important, talking about kind of deeper issues. And I think when you give the audience credit, as you say, in a lot of ways, you bring them closer to the work, as opposed to, when you try to feed somebody, when you try to feed a baby, at least my kids, they get to the point where they're kind of pushing you away, and they want to be active participants in the work. They want to be challenged. They want to see something new and different. So whether it's the content or the aesthetic approach, how you're presenting it, I just think in this crowded media landscape, I'm not going to cut through by trying to make something that, studios are making for $100 million in marketing for $500 million. I need to not worry about the commercial side or even calling all these resources to compete on that level. I need to cut through by being as original and of myself as I can, because that's the most valuable thing I have to offer. That's the most unique thing about what I can do, is what only I can do via my background, via my tastes, and via my, soul.
One would think or hope that Hollywood, I mean, and I come from, my wife and I are writers, and the same kind of mentality exists in the publishing industry, where they'd rather give Hillary Clinton or Michelle Obama $10 million for their autobiography or something that's going to be ghostwritten by someone. You would think that if the studios are going to spend, $2 billion a year and to make films, and okay, we're going to have 8 blockbusters or whatnot, or 9 blockbusters for 1.8 billion. That other 200 million, you could invest, say, 10 million each, and give 20 other little younger filmmakers a chance to do something with what, for you, 20 million would be nirvana for you. You could probably
Yeah.
do. It just seems to me, given the fail rate of even these so-called blockbusters, that it would just make sense to spread the seed a bit farther in the loam.
Yeah, I mean, you said it perfectly, and I can't really intellectualize an argument to the contrary, because for me, yeah, okay, you want to make your $200 million Marvel movie, and then spend another 400 million to make sure everybody in the world knows about it and can go see it. Fine, but for me, and from a business perspective, which is these are business people, I would find the most creative young artists, new voices, because that's what kind of shakes the world and makes people listen. New voices that say things in a different way. Yeah, give them. You say 20, you could give $5 million. You can make 100 movies for 5 million, and you still have to market them. People they make. The issue with independent movies is they don't. You kind of you finance the production. But the reason that movies like Marvel are even patronized are because they spend twice as much as they spend on the production, on the marketing. So if just indie filmmakers, you wouldn't even need to give these people $5 million to make films. You would just need to take the movies and market them, and you would make it back. You would find a profit. So I agree, it would be much better business as opposed to have a one bet 200 million, and any investment kind of manager, any banker, any kind of portfolio manager would tell you diversify. So tell 40 stories for 5 million a piece, and then you could have 10 20 hits on your hand as opposed to one. And a $200 million movie does not have a better chance to make money than a $5 million movie by virtue of the content or the aesthetic or anything. The only reason it does is because they're going to spend another 200, 400 million to market it. So if you put that into you can make these movies more efficiently than they're making them. Everybody wants to keep their salaries high. Everybody wants to, so I think it's a broken model, and it's going to take, I don't root for anyone to fail because I think everyone's working hard to do their best, but it's going to take some of those disasters like you saw maybe in the early 90s or in the 50s to kind of flush away the kind of corporate monopoly from our art, our culture, and get some new ideas in here that can push the culture forward. Because I think this stuff is important. I think the stories we tell define the people we are, and they shape our future. So if you keep kind of telling corporate stories, you're going to have a corporate culture. So I think artists will keep fighting, and will have their day.
It filters down even here, because on YouTube, for example, if you look at the popular YouTube channels, there are 14-year-old girls who give makeup tips, or people who write about jackass, doing these jackass kind of stunts, and they get 20 million views. Whereas an intelligent conversation with you for an hour or more might only get 500-600 in the first year views.
To your point, it's McDonald's versus food that's cheap and widely available and marketed heavily and addictive via the ingredients, but ultimately offering no nutrition, versus food that's homemade, prepared by an individual with their heart and soul from a unique recipe and high quality ingredients and with passion. And that's going to nourish you and make you feel better ultimately. So, yeah, I think people, it's incumbent upon the audience, but I think the forces of culture, be they business, government. I think if you want a more productive, intelligent, healthy society, you will encourage and champion. I don't know any other way to say it than true art.
You mentioned a 50-year-old film, The Graduate, earlier on, and I think a lot of studio types are looking for these, moments that people are going to go, oh wow, around a water cooler. You got to go see this, and so they think, oh, we're going to have this explosion, or we're going to have this buffed up star, we're going to have this monster do this or whatnot. But you can only push that so far. When I think of something like The Graduate, the two moments in that film that everyone talked about was the shot between the leg with Anne Bancroft's leg seeing Dustin Hoffman, and then the end where they run away together, they're on the bus, and it's like, oh, and you can see the disappointment in their faces. Those are the things that make, well, that people talked about that film. And thinking back to your film, Covadonga, a film like that, well, you could, when you're dancing, your character's dancing with the mop there. At first, it seems kind of innocent and whimsical until you find out that he's a widower. And those kinds of moments that people could talk about seem to be much more ripe and able to be newer and more interesting than a bigger explosion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I go to some of these because I have two kids, so it's hard for me to get to the theater. But if I can sneak away and play hooky, I'll go to the theater. And whenever, there's no kind of indie movie in the multiplex, I'll look at one of these big blockbusters. And I am at the point where I either, my mind glazes over and I just spend the time thinking about something else, or I'll walk out, because those kind of digital storms that just swarm the screen, and you call them explosions. A lot of times they've just got these superheroes flying through the air, and it is digital. It's computer generated, and which has its place in filmmaking, certainly. But to me, I disassociate, because I just see animation and I lose people and feeling. And the moments you speak of are the ones that speak to me too. And what I remember and reverberate throughout the history of cinema, throughout the history of art, is people and emotion, specifically faces. So you're never going to, whether it's Marlon Brando screaming Stella in the street, it's just a person and their emotional output, which you innately relate to because you've felt it before. And it makes you empathetic and understand everybody, understand that we're all a family. So when you put people flying in the air behind metal suits, and it's not actually people, but digital images, but computerized images, yes, you kind of lose your connection with humanity. And I think as fun as these superheroes are in terms of archetypal stories, which we had in Westerns and whatever else, I think the best stories teach us that nobody's coming to save you. We have to save ourselves by loving each other.
This may seem an odd question, but getting to you're talking about CGI, it just came up. I think with another filmmaker, or maybe it was one of my actor interviews, I brought up the idea that modern CGI, these Incredibles type computer characters, to me, seem less identifiable than, say, the old style Disney or Looney Tunes drawn characters, because they were drawn by hand. And I don't know if it's because the human hand can do things a bit more subtly than a computer can. Do you sense something like that? I mean, you're old enough to remember those classic cartoons. What is your take on that?
That's a great question, and I was talking about it yesterday with my family members. Not only am I old enough to remember the classic cartoons, but I now have young children who watch not only new cartoons, but reboots of these old cartoons that are in the new animation style that you talk about. So digital, perfect, three-dimensional often. And so I think it's two things. One, we like it more because we grew up on it, so we're conditioned to feel that that's better. But I also feel that it's better because what you say, it's done organically by a human hand. And I think what we feel indelibly, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, is humanity in a piece of work, via the imperfection. Now, people are trying to make everything perfect so that it will be more valuable, more a better commodity. But ultimately, what makes something unique and different and valuable is the imperfection. So when you kind of smooth off these edges, you're left with corporate art. You're left with commerce. You're left without personality. So, and that I think can reverberate through culture in people trying to portray themselves perfectly through their social media accounts, people trying to alter their uh, physicality through plastic surgery, trying to look like somebody they see on TV. But yes, I think it ultimately makes us less empathetic and less realistic about the truth of the world and each other, because we are imperfect, we are human, we are organic. So to me, the best art that speaks to people, that moves people, that people remember, and that carries forward through time is organic, is of us. It's not digital.
Let me ask a question on cinematography. Since you were in virtually every scene in Covadonga, you obviously had a cameraman, a cinematographer actually shooting it. Did you? And I'm going to get into my main point in a moment. Did you tell him you want it shot this way with this type of lens, or in this kind of aspect ratio, or whatnot, or did you let him have the say so there?
The former. I compose the shots and the movements and decide the lenses and all that, because I edit the movie. I kind of know how I want to put it together. I actually write camera moves to the extent that it's not difficult to read into the script, or at least the beginning, just to set an aesthetic and a visual style that a reader might kind of be able to interpret and visualize. So for me, I see it beforehand, and in order to make it efficiently in terms of the schedule, I need to shoot a very efficient ratio, like someone like Hitchcock. I can't shoot a bunch of stuff I'm not going to use. So I need to know how to cut it, and I need to be very specific about all the angles and the movement and that. Now you have a technician like your cinematographer who's able to give ideas and feedback. Maybe this lens will work better for what you're trying to do, and then we generally look at different focal lengths and just decide on the best way. But I know what I'm doing, or what I want to see, and then you have these technicians to help you achieve it.
The reason I ask is, have you seen the American Western film Shane?
Yeah.
Okay, and here's why I ask. Back about 10 years ago, in the O's, there were two films that came out. One was Y Tu Mama Tambien, and the other was Sean Penn directed Into the Wild, about this guy who goes off into Alaska and ends up dying. And people raved about the so-called cinematography in Y Tu Mama Tambien, the Andes, and about the Alaskan Rockies being shot in the Sean Penn film. And I said, what are you talking about? They just put a camera there. They did nothing with it. But if you look at Shane and the Grand Tetons, you look at I forget the director, George, whoever it was. He did the James Dean film as well. Stevens, right? George Stevens. If you look at the way he uses the Grand Tetons in shots where there's actions, they look like normal mountains. But when there's shots that are emotionally fragile and the people are talking, he uses a long distance lens, or whatever you call it, and he brings the Grand Tetons up much bigger than they are. That's cinematography. That's good cinematography of mountains. Just showing a beautiful mountain isn't in and of itself cinematography. It's using something beautiful for a higher purpose, which Stevens does in Shane, which has this mythic quality about this man who emerges from nowhere and then ends up going back over the mountains.
Yeah, I think that's well said, and I love the name Shane. But those movies, with George Stevens, or even of course John Ford, in the way he portrayed the West in a lot of the similar locations, that was inspiring. And what I've always tried to do, and I think heroes of mine like Martin Scorsese tried to do, is take a classic visual aesthetic, or a very what could be subjective or heightened, but beautiful imagery, like someone like John Ford, or then you've got masters like Orson Welles or Hitchcock, and these different guys, and then take Stanley Kubrick, and then take someone like John Cassavetes, who put such an emphasis on the performance and the naturalism, and kind of combine those. And that's when I think you get these amazing results of somebody like Martin Scorsese, where it's just beautiful imagery and camera work colliding with just raw, warts and all humanity. And to me, that's like Van Gogh. That's as good as it gets.
Yeah, well, like that famous scene in Goodfellas where all the Goombas are lined up and the camera just follows them through the restaurant. It's like, hey, Joey D, hey, how you doing? And you get all these people.
Yeah.
So let me talk about your first film for a moment, Beach Pillows. You said that had 10 times the budget, and it had a few people who are quote-unquote names, Annette O'Toole, Vincent Kartheiser, who is the fellow from Mad Men, right?
Yeah.
So were you able to get a bigger budget because of these people being involved?
Yeah, I think you're able to raise money. I mean, at that time, I thought that was low, considering the scope of the production, the different settings and stuff, and then having those actors on board. Richard Schiff is an Emmy winner. Vincent's show Mad Men was kind of all the rave at the time. And Annette and Jeffrey are, great actors in their own right, and have, I think Annette won an Oscar for a song she did for The Mighty Wind with her husband. So anyway, it was much easier, I think, just to ask people. Like, I'm not at the point where I would be the lead in something like Covadonga. I wouldn't have tried to raise $500,000 to make Covadonga, just because I know that you don't need it, but two, it's like, just to make the business of it feasible. Like, I've got these names, so they equate to such, that should be able to get it distributed, released, and maybe even somebody help us market it. So, I think when you go to people, it's always great. That's the number one thing. If anybody wants to finance a movie, and what was essential for me turning the corner on Beach Pillows, attach an actor. That helps you attach other actors, and it helps you raise money. So that's kind of an undeniable truth of the business.
And because these people had worked on television, I'm assuming they're union actors. Was that a union project versus Covadonga?
Yeah, I think I was able to designate it as SAG ultra low, which, you produce it for a certain amount, that everybody works at scale. So I think they got like $100 a day or something. And then they get points on the movie, so they get equity.
Oh, okay. And now getting back to Covadonga and the distribution method, is this something that you think can only work with an ultra micro budget film, or do you think that in 5 or 10 years you could do, if you were able to raise, say, $1 million or $2, distribute something larger? Because it seems to me that that about 10 years ago, people were predicting that streaming was going to be all the rage, and people have been predicting the death of film theaters, since television came 70 years ago, and yet still more people go to sit in the big theaters. So what is your looking out a decade or so? Do you at these business models? How do you see it morphing or not from what it is?
I think it is a good way. But not just specifically the way I've done it. I can't imagine why, an ingredient that I'm missing right now is kind of recognition and some kind of marketing wind at my back. So if I was a filmmaker of pedigree, or with millions of Twitter followers or something, I would do it this way, and assuming nobody comes in and blows up what Vimeo has going, because they let you keep 90% of the ticket, of the transaction. Mm-hmm. Whereas with something like iTunes, I go through a distributor who takes a third, and then iTunes takes another third, and then I'm left with a third versus 90%. Yeah. So if you don't need them to market it, which they're not, if I'm like Bradley Cooper or something and I want to make an independent film that I own, you know, people are going to find the movie however they have to. And being that it's literally available on their television, on their computer in all the same ways as these other movies, and they can make more money, let everybody know that it only exists in one place. So I kind of, Covadonga film. Say you had a movie like whatever, A Star Is Born film. Like everybody could go there. They know how much it costs. It's available in Africa on the same day it's available in New York, and people can just start buying it. And you know who's buying it. As they're buying it. To me, it's a good model in terms of learning what works on the marketing end. And like I said, if you have an audience financially, I don't see why you wouldn't do it this way, unless those platforms like Amazon, iTunes, etc., are helping you market it, because otherwise you're kind of making pennies or a fraction of what you can otherwise make. And you mentioned the theatrical experience. Yes, I mean, there's nothing better than seeing a movie, consuming this art in a communal setting alongside other people and feeling it together. I love that. I cherish the opportunity to see Covadonga at the Museum of the Moving Image and Anthology Film Archives and all these, the Gene Siskel Film Center in Chicago, all these different places I screened it for festivals. But in my position, in order to put it in a theater would be like, I think I was looking at like $3,000 per night or showing or something. So like, unless you've got the marketing then to sell out these showings, it's just a losing bet and almost a vanity play.
Yeah.
So I think you just have to be realistic about your marketing resources and the awareness you can create. But yeah, I think, movies alongside independent digital distribution is the theaters alongside independent digital distribution could be a cool thing because the gatekeepers are kind of evaporating, and I think it's a good thing.
I want to ask about actors' agencies, and since you've only done these 2 films, that maybe you had to deal with Cartiz's agent or O'Toole's agent or something, but I know when I've interviewed actors, a number of the actors, and I've interviewed 24, 25 of them, have told me that, and I've asked the specific question, have you ever passed on a film or a role that you regretted, either on Broadway or a film? And they said, yes, but sometimes it's that their agents didn't even let them know about a project. Now, I've always wondered, why wouldn't, if I'm Julia Roberts, if I'm Brad Pitt, if I'm Robert De Niro, although De Niro does help fund smaller projects, why wouldn't I want to go and help someone like you or a handful of these other guys and say to my agent, go out there, look at some of the guys who are doing the stuff on these micro budgets, cutting edge, something interesting. And even if I just have to read through 20 scripts that are shit, there's going to be 1 or 2 gems, and I want to help use my name to promote that. But it seems to me a lot of the times, especially these big agencies like CAA or whatnot, don't want it. It's like, you have radiation poisoning or something. It seems to me to just be sort of killing off the creative process that made these people stars in the first place. So what is your take on agencies?
You said it perfectly. I think the movies that made, let's think about these actors of the 70s like De Niro, Pacino, Jack Nicholson. They broke with these personal adult stories that were universal but cutting edge and challenging and artistic, let's just say. Now, the agencies, and of course those opportunities weren't facilitated by agencies, certainly in their current form. So without trying to burn any bridges, I don't have an agent, I don't have a manager, and my experience is what you described, and it's because agents get a percentage of the check that an actor gets. So they don't want that. They want that check to be as big as possible. An actor can probably only do 2 features a year. They want those to be studio movies. They want those to be multi-million-dollar paydays. Now, if an actor has to defer that payday to do a piece of art, then their agent's sitting there with their cash cow, not churning out the milk, or deferring the milk to a later date. So it's purely business, and you're right, they don't show them those scripts. So what it's incumbent upon independent artists like myself to do is circumvent those channels and get directly to the artist. And
so like if you were at some film festival and you saw Emma Stone or something, and you said, you know, Emma, I've got a really great script that is, you know, a late 20s thing. You'd be perfect for it. You wouldn't hesitate to go up and say, you know, could you at least look at my script personally?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in that, well, you've got to be sensitive to the fact that they experience that a lot, so you don't want it to become white noise.
Yeah.
What it'd be nice to do is have a piece of work to kind of hang your hat on, that you can say, this is the kind of thing I can do, to show some value that you're bringing to the table. And then, you know, like, just have a really strong case for why this person should be in this. Give them an opportunity for people to see them differently, to play a role that they maybe didn't think they got an opportunity to play. Like Jeffrey Arend was the first actor I cast for Beach Pillows, and he had always played like the second fiddle comic relief. But I thought, this is a tall actor with these very emotive eyes, and this Morgan, the lead in Beach Pillows, is a passive kind of reactive character, more of a leading man, and Nick Vincent Kartheiser is more that other role. So I wanted to give Jeffrey an opportunity that he hadn't had before, and he really responded to that, to be a lead. So somebody, you know, let somebody be a lead. Write a part for an older actor, because as we know, studios aren't, you know, pumping out, you know, films with older actors as the leads. So I think the best advice I could do with respect to approaching someone like Emma Stone is think about somebody that you think is amazing, but that you see something inside of them that they haven't been able to show otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 53. I'd sooner look at a sexy actress like Diane Lane than Emma Stone. Nothing against Emma Stone. She's too young for me.
Right. You said it. You said it. And that audience exists, and they spend money, and I couldn't have said it better. You know, give people, well, it's representation, right? You know, we hear all of this talk about representation, and that spans, you know, every aspect of humanity, age included.
Sean, you just mentioned representation, and one of, I think, the best filmmakers going in the last decade has been Steve McQueen, the British filmmaker, not the actor, and he's a black fellow, and his first two films had nothing to do with quote-unquote blackness, and I think Shame, his second film, is a great masterpiece, and it's not on sex addiction, it's about loneliness. The sex addiction is just into the idea of loneliness. But a lot of people would say that, for example, if you came up with an idea, or let's say if you had cast a black actor in Covadonga, well, or did a quote-unquote black or Chinese or Jewish topic, that you would be treading lines. Do you ever fear about that thing? I mean, if you had an idea for, say, a Chinatown where the actual characters were Chinese, the main characters, not just dilly-dallying in like the Nicholson character, would you do that, or would you fear some kind of backlash that could ruin your career?
Yeah, I think that's a good, timely question. I see it as, you know, if a studio's making a property that represents, for example, Chinese characters or whomever else ethnically, I think it's wise to them to approach writers or filmmakers, certainly cast, that have familiarity with the, you know, the characters they're portraying, whether they are them. I think that's how you get better work, more authentic work. So I think studios, it is incumbent upon them to try to, you know, if it's Wonder Woman, you know, have a woman direct it. If you're telling a story about Asian characters, you know, let's just try to get an Asian director. I don't think they should be boycotted if that's not the case, because, you know, Hollywood and art in general, these are liberal pursuits. These are about empathy.
Well, one of the things, if I could just say, like when there's a writer named Jhumpa Lahiri, and she's Indian, and she writes about Indian things. But the Indian things tend to be these very banal things that you're basically taking white yuppies and making them Indians. If you've seen a Satyajit Ray film, for example,
Yeah.
yeah, an Indian fellow. I mean, he does this universal stuff, even in small films about, and I've seen only a handful. My wife has watched more. He's so incisive, and
Yeah.
it's not about being Indian. It's about being human, and that's the thing that I think political correctness misses. Is if you're going to tell a story, you could take two people from Peru or Aborigines or from the Aleutian Islands, and it's going to resonate not because they're these minorities, but because they're humans. And whether you're chowing down a whale blubber or a steak, you know these people.
Yeah, and I think you said it, and I think that's why it's valuable. Because, okay, if I, as a Caucasian American, am making a story about Indians, for example, I may bring inadvertently, unintentionally, an outside perspective, and I'm kind of seeing these people as Indian.
Yeah.
Whereas if Ray was making that film, he's just showing people, and it's personal to him, and that's why the stories become universal. So I think that by having an authentic filmmaker that kind of sits more in that perspective, they can make it more universal. Now, as an independent filmmaker, if I am inspired to make a story about any subject, I'm not going to relent because I'm afraid of the political ramifications. Because I'm here to tell these stories for a reason. I feel called to tell them, so I wouldn't be afraid to tell any story. You just have to, yes, you have to be sitting in it, and you can't look at it from the outside necessarily. At least the way I like to tell stories and make films. So, yeah, I think better stories are told when you feel like people are telling a story from their eyes and perspective. Now, that doesn't mean the ethnicity of the creators and those being represented have to match. I think when you limit artists, even in terms of what characters a certain actor can play, I think the great thing about all of this is we can get in other people's shoes. That's why art is a vehicle for empathy and change. So I don't think we should limit those opportunities for ourselves, for audiences, for anyone. I think we should tell stories of different kinds of people and not be afraid to. But at the same time, the people with money and that make decisions, yeah, if you have a story to tell about an Indian character, get an Indian filmmaker. Come here. I just gotta hold on. All right, mommy's out here, son. I'm finishing doing some work. Yes. Sorry, buddy.
we can if you want, I can leave that in. It's a nice moment, or I can edit
Yeah,
it
you
out.
can leave it. That's fine.
Okay. I'm going to ask a couple of questions that probably only I would ask. So, as I mentioned earlier, my wife and I are writers, and also both of us started out writing poetry. And my wife, when she goes to work, she works in a biology lab. She often feels embarrassed to tell her coworkers that she's an artist because of all the stereotypes involved. So, in your private life, do you work within the industry, or do you do work, that's not related to art? And do you tell the people that you work with that, oh, I'm a filmmaker, or do you keep it quiet because they'll say, ha 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 ha, yeah.
That's funny. Well, I do make a living 9 to 5 outside of the industry, and the people I work with know what I do because, yeah, I think at a certain point, in order to even get the resources and the help to make these films, you've got to kind of stop being afraid or embarrassed. I think there were times in my life where I was like, oh, being on camera or playing music in front of people, putting my ideas and emotions in front of people, that is a little embarrassing and you feel vulnerable. But I kind of ripped off that Band-Aid and have been much better for it artistically. I think the best artists and the most successful artists are ultimately unafraid and feel like what they're doing is valuable to people. So that, while you have insecurity, of course, and that's kind of an inherent characteristic of an artist, you've got to, one, art is a field, it's a no business. When you put it in a business context, it's about rejection, which is kind of ironic because artists are probably the most sensitive to rejection, and that's why we end up telling these stories, because we process these emotions and try to turn them into kind of lessons or something. But via heightened sensitivity. But, I think I understand the way your wife feels, and I think every artist kind of, and Beach Pillows in many ways is overcoming some of those insecurities. But yeah, at a certain point, you have to feel like I'm here to do this. This is inside of me, and it's valuable to other people. So I don't think pride is the answer, because that's a sin. But yeah, it's just purpose. I think once you feel like you have purpose, you can kind of overcome some of those insecurities or embarrassment. Because no, for me, it's like I'm proud of it, because I've gotten to the point, even though I'm not this big name, and you say Covadonga or Beach Pillows to even a film fan, they may not necessarily be aware, but I'm telling stories from my corner of the world, and I'm representing everybody in my life, and my entire family. And, I want to bring people to my corner of the world, and I want to bring my corner of the world to people. So it's like when we talk about Cassavetes or Hitchcock or Orson Welles, you've got to be part artist, part carnival barker. So you can't really be successful unless you take the business side head on.
I want to talk about quality in art, and my website, I still, to this day, I get a couple of thousand submissions of poems and other writing today, and most of it's terrible. Most of it comes from India, which is the world's leading manufacturer of bad writers. But people always talk about, well, I like or dislike, rather than saying something is good or bad. And I always tell artists, I said, you have to know the difference between what you like and dislike and what is good and bad. For example, Ingmar Bergman is a great filmmaker, and Persona is one of his greatest films. But I don't particularly like it, and I could go into it, but the point is I don't particularly like it. There are plenty of 1950s sci-fi schlock films that I love, but I know that it's bad filmmaking. So, number one, what is your take on quality versus your personal like? And secondly, can you name a great film you just don't like and a bad film you love?
Oh boy. Let me start with that second part of the question, and see if that can inspire the rest. I love popular entertainment, so maybe that's something to focus on. God, I see. I do look for the assets of a work, and that's kind of my approach. In order to find any nutrition. But okay, a great, supposedly great film that I'm not a fan of, that I don't like.
Yeah.
This is hard. This is hard. All right. Let's see. Oh, Dunkirk. I thought it was garbage. So to me, Dunkirk, it's like you've got this very captivating, true story, and the hubris and the ego of the filmmaker, and their, this device that Christopher Nolan uses through all his work, and I use myself selectively, a fractured narrative. To me, he's got an intellectual idea and imposes it on a piece of drama, and neuters it, takes all the drama out of it, makes it incoherent, makes it emotionally disassociated. Like, you're in the thick of all these scenes with these characters in their shoes, and then you're just cutting to a different time of the day, different place. It's like, I understand intellectually the approach, but the effect is a misfire, in my opinion. So I felt like, I feel like he hurts his own material in ways, by trying to impress this signature onto his film. So that's probably a minority opinion. It was nominated for Best Picture, but it didn't work for me. Now the opposite. Why don't you name some bad movies?
Well, I mean, for example, I'm not a Steven Spielberg fan. I find his scripts and screenplays to be very juvenile. I'll take a Cassavetes any day over. Now, that's not to say that technically Steven Spielberg's films are very good, high quality, but the stories always sort of go down. So, I mean, I could say it's like both. What was the Holocaust one, Schindler's List, and the one that followed it, the World War II film, Saving Private Ryan. I mean, The Thin Red Line, which came out in the same year by Malick, was just so much better, so much richer, so much deeper. The Spielberg film, for example, had every possible cliche. You had the Italian, you had the Jew, you had the Irishman, and then you had Tom Hanks, Mr. We must go in, and it's all to save this worthless schlub of a character played by Matt Damon, and to me, that was such a bad film because it was every bad war movie just smushed into one another and sold because of the first 20 minutes or so of the
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to, I felt some of the cliches you're talking about when I saw it initially and didn't perceive it as a masterwork because of them. But obviously there's some high quality filmmaking in there that is what people remember. So I would agree with your opinions there. I love Spielberg and a bunch of his work. So let me just go with something just because it was like, Commando, like formative 80s action movies. Like I know that Howard the Duck is considered like the one of the biggest bombs of all time, and people have a distaste for it. But for us as kids, we would seek out that movie like treasure. Like to us, it was funny. There was nothing better. You've got this duck who's having sex and this bad guy with red eyes or whatever. So we loved it.
Well, I'll give you something because you have two little girls, right?
Boys.
Boys. Okay. Well, two films that you should have your kids watch, and you can watch it with them, is if you've ever seen the 1940s version, Return of the Cat People, which is the sequel to the original Cat People. It's about a little girl dealing with the death of her mother, who was the original cat person in there. And it's told from the view of a little girl. And it's not a horror film. It's a Val Lewton film directed. Yeah. I don't know if it shocked him. Right. Watch that with her because it's one of the most really great films that deals with the way a child sees the world. And the other one that, if you have boys, watch Godzilla's Revenge. It's about a little latchkey boy. And people make fun of the film because it's a mishmash of the other films. But it's really about a little boy who's left alone by his parents. He gets into trouble with bullies. He gets into trouble with some gangsters who in his neighborhood, which is not a good neighborhood. And there's also a neighbor who may or may not be a pedophile in there. And it deals again with a child's point of view. Those two films are films that I wouldn't say they're great cinema per se, but they are far underrated and they're great children's films. But anyway.
Cool. Definitely. Well, I've got the Cat People, like I said, and I'll look up Godzilla Returns because
Godzilla's Revenge. Godzilla's Revenge.
But he's infatuated with dinosaurs, and we look at Godzilla stuff, so he'll be fired up for that one. And while we're on it, I'll just also mention, you tell me the filmmaker, Karate Kid, Rocky, Lean on Me.
Well, John Avildsen did Rocky.
Yeah.
Didn't he?
Yes, Avildsen.
Yeah.
So I think if we look at those movies, Karate Kid, Rocky, Lean on Me, and then he made a movie called Save the Tiger with Jack Lemmon. Those are great movies. I think Rocky gets lumped in with some of the sequels and just this, sequel-driven commercial machismo-based filmmaking. But I think Karate Kid is like a perfect movie and a masterpiece. And I think Lean on Me is super powerful. So I think that guy, while he makes, populist movies, was a undersung, just master filmmaker.
What is the next project or film that you're looking to do?
The next movie is called The Start, and it's about
The Star? The Star?
The Start with the T on the end. and it's about the first artist and our exit from Eden.
Okay.
So it's about the first artist who painted on caves,
Huh.
the effect this had, what inspired him to do so, the effect it had on his family and community, and ultimately our species. So to me, it's like the essential biblical kind of tale that we're all trying to tell. And I feel like it's my third film. I feel like I've been building towards this. It's my purpose, and I've written it, and I'm working with a producer and trying to attach a specific actor to the lead here. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I'm going to make it. I plan to make it in Ireland, in the caves of Kesh, in Sligo, Northern Ireland, and I'm just so deeply interested and affected by our human beginnings. And, to me, our ability to think symbolically and represent these thoughts and emotions to each other is what distinguishes us from the animal kingdom, for good or ill. So I see it as the story of the forbidden fruit falling off the tree and the story of creation. So it's pretty essential.
I forget the name of the film, but Werner Herzog did a documentary about cave art.
Forgotten Dreams, yeah.
Right. So it's not one of his, I don't think it's one of his better documentaries like some of the others, but it does have some interesting points, so you've already seen that. And let me just ask finally then, are there any points that you'd like to make about either your own films or film in general that we haven't touched on yet?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I may have had some highfalutin ideas in terms of what I was trying to get across here, but you've asked great questions, so I just appreciate the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. No, I don't think. Feel free to ask anything else. I'm blanking now. These have been great questions. I appreciate it.
Well, that's about all for me. I do hope that you will send me a link or a DVD or whatever you have of your next film so I can watch it, and maybe we can do a return engagement in a few years. But it was good. I think there needs to be more people like you. I've done interviews with some other indie filmmakers, and it's just for me very it's unsettling to know that there's so few people within the industry that care about the industry for something more than just money making. And I don't have nothing against money, and I'm not one of these people that, the starving artist. That's bullshit. I grew up poor. Starving is not good, whether you're an artist or not. But whether it's MFA programs that try to manufacture writers like Henry Ford did cars, or whether it's Hollywood studios or agencies that don't see the value in giving back to the thing that nurtured them. It just, to me, is very, very, I don't know, self-defeating, it seems.
Yes, it is. And the engine will break. The studio engine will break under its own weight and lack of ideas if what you described doesn't change. But I feel like the landscape is changing such that it's not about an industry. It's just going to become about artists telling stories from their corners of the world. And now all our corners are connecting. So I think there will be a sea change soon, and certainly eventually, because the power, as difficult as it is at times and frustrating and, as you say, disconcerting, power and opportunity has been flooding towards artists. And the commercial mechanism that exploits the work is afraid. There's an allergy because they're like, how do I get my piece? So they'll keep trying to figure out how to control the conversation and get their piece. But I think evolution always wins. Darwin wins. So art wins.
Well, I'll link to your Facebook page and a couple of other pages that you want me to link to below this video. So anyone who's interested, whether they're just a movie buff or anyone who might want to invest any money, can contact you. So Sean Hartofilis, thanks for speaking to me.
My pleasure. It's great to know you, Dan. Thanks for all the great work you're doing on the behalf of this art that we love so much. Have a great weekend. Happy holidays, pal.